Potentially poisonous phytoplankton discovered in local waters has caused sweeping shellfish closures. To learn more, we chat with Natural Resource Officer Amy Croteau on this episode of Barnstable Today. It's Friday, October 14th, 2016. I'm Sarah Mantle. Amy, some big news this week I can't even pronounce this, but some shellfish poisoning happening. Tell me what's going on with this situation.
Okay, so unique to Massachusetts this year, we've had a bloom of an algae. We have a lot of marine algae that are present in our water at all times. Under certain conditions, they tend to bloom earlier this summer. We had a cochlidinium bloom, which is a type of dinoflagellate. And it appears that now we have a diatom, which is another different kind of marine plankton that falls into the family Pseudoneatia, that is blooming outside and inside of Buzzards Bay and Nantucket Sound. So this bloom has been occurring routinely in Maine and also in Rhode Island. And the unique thing about this marine algae is that it can create a neurotoxin called domoic acid that can cause a shellfish poisoning that we refer to as ASP. It's called amnesic shellfish poisoning, and it is definitely something that you do not take lightly. There are a number of different kinds of shellfish poisoning that you can contract by eating shellfish that carry, these sort of toxins in their tissues. When we have red tide closures, it's because of PSP, Alexandrium, or paralytic shellfish poisoning. There are other species that can carry DSP, or diuretic shellfish poisoning, but ASP is caused by this domoic acid, and it has a sort of long list of nasty symptoms and side effects that it can have on people who consume this shellfish. Gastroenteritis typically sets in within 24 hours of consumption and can be noted by nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and abdominal cramps. But within 36 to 48 hours of the consumption of those shellfish, neurological issues can start to show up. And symptoms of that can include, but are not limited to, dizziness, headache, seizures, disorientation, short-term memory loss that can become permanent.
Oh my goodness.
Respiratory difficulty, coma, and even death.
So this is really, when you said this is really nothing to mess around with, this is really nothing to mess around with. These are some really, really significant symptoms.
Yes, and as a shellfish officer, we often try to explain to the public who sort of tend to not understand the inherent shadiness of dealing in shellfish. But there are a lot of things that you can consume that, if handled improperly by yourself, at the market, at the dealer, can make you very sick and can potentially kill you. It's not as simple as, you eat some undercooked meat and you get sick. Like, you can legitimately die from a lot of these things. So when Division of Marine Fisheries found out that this bloom is sort of moving into these areas of Cape Cod, they instituted a precautionary closure. And that came into effect this past Monday. And it will remain in effect until further notice for all of our shellfish areas that are on the south side of town. If you have a shellfish regulation book, if you look at our maps online, you can see that areas are designated with either an SC or a CCB. So anything that has an SC designation until further notice will remain closed. That means for most of our recreational fishery that you're not going to West Bay, you're not going to Katuitt Bay. North Bay is closed this time of year anyway, but you're not hitting up North Bay right now. Cape Cod Bay, which is CCB designation, or the north side of town, remains open, but you do have to be mindful when you go out of closures that are already in place prior to this event happening.
Okay, very important to know and understand. And you said that this will be in effect for quite a while. Why will it take so long to reopen these areas?
Well, so this is sort of a unique bloom, and that Division of Marine Fisheries doesn't have a lot of experience with ASP. and they have to run a certain kind of chromatography to test for the presence of this toxin. There are actually 14 different species in the Pseudonetia family, and only 7 of them create this toxin. And even when those 7 are blooming, they don't necessarily create that toxin along with the bloom. So they have to take enough samples that they can test for the presence of that toxin and then determine whether or not an area would need to be closed. If there's any more than 20 micrograms per liter of this toxin in the water, then it constitutes a more lengthy closure. But because the only equipment available to run these samples is in Maine, there is, in fact, a turnaround time on that. So they said to expect, as with any harmful algal bloom closure, it's typically at least a 2-week closure that we would be looking at, if nothing else, even if this just remains, precautionary, about 2 weeks of the closure.
Well, and for sure, like you said, it's not something we want to mess around with, so I don't think anyone's going to have any arguments about taking precautions for our safety for sure. Tell me, is there a reason that these algae blooms are maybe more prevalent right now? Does it have to do with the drought over the summer, or what are the conditions that
are... So over the summer when we saw the cochleodinium bloom, it's a typical algae bloom. When they have limiting factors are typically availability of food, availability of light, and availability of nutrient concentrations. When you have an absence of those limiting factors, algae tend to thrive and then would tend to bloom. Now, the Pseudonetia family is a bit interesting in that they tend to bloom when our temperatures of water are actually starting to fall, which typically happens this time of year. Because they are a diatom, they have a tendency to sink in the water column versus a dinoflagellate, which can kind of swim around in the upper water column. And when they have an upwelling event in turbulent water where it's pushing nutrients up from the bottom up to these diatoms, when the water temperature drops, they actually thrive in that environment versus their other competition of plankton. So they would bloom under these conditions rather than in the middle of the summer, let's say.
Wow, it's so interesting. Is there anything that we can do to clean it up or prevent it or move the process along, or is this just something we have to just wait and let nature take its course?
This is definitely something that you have to sort of wait to let nature take its course. Algae blooms are completely natural events, and these animals create these toxins as part of their natural biochemistry. And so this is just something that we have to manage and that we have to stay on top of when we see these blooms. But other than, just doing the rain dance every summer and praying that, we have slight changes that in our environment, this year was basically a perfect situation for plankton blooms. So without some environmental changes next season, it's likely that these blooms will continue to happen throughout the summer and fall months.
I've never heard of a closure like this before. Amy, is this something that's happened here in Barnstable before?
For ASP, no. And even when we have a red tide closure, it typically takes place in April or May and is usually only on the north side of town. So this is a unique closure for our south side for sure.
What would you recommend for residents if they're shellfishing? How can they avoid these areas? What do they need to know?
They need to know that they need to look at signage. We have done a very good job of posting the fact that these areas are closed, even at ways to water that don't have shellfish information boards. We have been putting posts up on tiny little trails that go out to shellfish areas, and people have literally just been walking by them. So take a moment to look at the big red sign that says that it's closed to shellfishing before you go out and harvest animals that could potentially make you very ill.
Absolutely. Definitely something we all need to keep in mind. Thank you so much for joining me. This licensing authority meets Monday at 9:30 in the morning in the Town Hall hearing room. The Recreation Commission will meet Monday evening at 5:30 in the Town Hall hearing room. And finally, the Sandy Neck Board will meet Monday night at 7:30 in the Selectmen's Conference Room. We'll be sure to tune in to our hour-long news program, Barnstable This Morning, weekdays at 8 a.m. On Monday's show, we'll learn more about Barnstable Intermediate School during our Principal Perspective segment. Plus, we'll have all the news and information you need. For Barnstable Today, I'm Sarah Mannel.